Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. This is part 5 of a 6-part series called The Diversity of Trans, where we are exploring and listening to and learning from various experiences within the broader trans conversation. And this series surrounds the launch of my book, which came out a few days ago, called Embodied: Transgender Identities, the Church, and what the Bible has to say. So if these conversations have raised many more questions than you thought you even had, then I encourage you to check out my book. It's available where books are sold. And another goal with these conversations is that we would continue to put flesh on a topic that often is treated at arm's length, treated as some polarized issue within the culture wars. And I want to deconstruct that approach and reconstruct it with real people at the center of it. Now, in the last 2 conversations, we've gotten to know 2 friends of mine who have gone through both a stage, who have both transitioned and then detransitioned. One of them, Kyla, detransitioned back to her birth sex because she had an encounter with Christ and believed that was the right thing for her to do. My other friend, Helena, does not claim any religious identity, and she also ended up transitioning and detransitioning for other reasons. Now, in this episode, we're going to get to know my friend Addie. Sold out believer in Jesus, experienced dysphoria from a very young age, tried to alleviate that dysphoria through other means and through much prayer and reading and study and counsel. She decided to transition from male to female and is still identifies as female and is very happy with her transition. And so this is going to be a different story than the last 2 stories that you heard. And again, I think it's so important for us to get to know a wide range of trans people so that we will understand that if you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person. So without further ado, let's get to know my good friend, Addie. All right, I'm here with my friend Addie. Addie, thanks so much for coming on Theology in the Raw. This is long overdue. I mean, it's something that I've been wanting to do for a while, but thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Preston, for having me on. I've been following your blog and some of your work since you launched the Center for Sexuality, Gender, and Faith, and just so happy to be here. I know we met in New York, probably, I don't know now, like last year before all this COVID craziness was happening.
It was just over a year ago.
Yeah, and I really appreciated the kind of tone you set at that conference. I actually had an opportunity to dine with a few folks that were attending your conference in Manhattan afterwards, and just the types of conversations that came out of that little workshop were amazing. And me being a trans person and engaging with other Christians in a really cool dialogue was something really special to me. Yeah. And so that's why I'm super glad to be talking with you now.
Well, I was so glad to meet you because we actually met online. I mean, when I first started blogging about the trans conversation, I was just kind of working out some thoughts, some, putting stuff together. And I'll never forget reading your comment. I don't even remember this. You left an extended comment. It was really just like, thank you so much. And a lot of agreement. And then towards the end, you kind of threw in, as somebody who transitioned from, male to female, my journey looks a little maybe different, but I just so appreciate your, to me, my attempt to kind of understand this conversation.
Yeah.
And I was just like, man, I was so impressed with your posture and humility. And and then we met in New York, and I didn't even know, like we were talking, and you're like,
I know.
I'm Addie. I'm like, whoa, you're like the
Wait,
Addie
what? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So, why don't you tell us your story? I mean, I don't know how you can begin at birth if you want, or how far back you want to go, but we'd love for people to get to know your story and.
Yeah, well, I know you've had a lot of different guests, and that's one thing I've appreciated. Like you said, you have just wanted to show a lot of different experiences, and every time you meet a trans person nowadays, that can mean a lot of different things. And so it's always really important, as we're engaging as Christians in this topic, to really know the person and get to know their story first. And my story probably starts out like a lot of Christian evangelical kids. I went to a conservative church. I was steeped into the 16th century Calvinism, Reformation. I was catechized from 5th grade onwards until I graduated high school. And so it was a unique experience to be a conservative Christian, and even still to this day, a Christian that really likes to wrestle with scripture. After listening to you for probably a year and a half now, I know that's part of your story, is when you came to Christ, just wanting to dig in scripture. And that's how I felt growing up. I grew up in the church, but I wrestled with gender dysphoria from a very young age. Probably at the age of 4, I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have the words to kind of describe it. And it wasn't until I was probably about 7, around 1st, 2nd grade, that I started realizing that, boys and girls are different, and I don't necessarily want to be grouped in with the boys, or don't feel comfortable being grouped in with the other boys. And it was at that point that I decided, even as a young kid, that this wasn't something that was really safe to talk about. Every Wednesday night, our church would have like adult speakers while the kids were at Sunday school. And sometimes I would sneak in after, our classes ended and listen to some of the speakers. And I just remember one instance where there was a Alliance Defending Freedom person repping, talk about how they're, fighting the culture war and fighting against homosexuality and all this type of language about how like something that's hated now is going to be praised later. And so as a young child, even though they weren't talking about transgender folk, which that wasn't even on the radar back then, I don't even think I knew what, trans was. I just felt very scared. And I saw these people that would be teaching me in Bible school, but then hear them scoff and kind of be disgusted at the fact of like these homosexuals and, LGBT stuff, that I just felt scared. And so I decided that that wrestling with dysphoria became a spiritual problem for me. It was something that I decided to fight against from a very young age. I prayed about it a lot. I prayed every night, and it just felt like something that I could not get rid of. And that stayed that way. And the way I kind of describe my story is, you can live like that for a long time, but there are definitely peaks and ebbs and flows to dysphoria. And I just felt like every time it came back and reminded me, it just got worse and worse. And that was probably when I was in 2nd grade. I started to realize, I think my mother was watching something on the Today Show, and they were interviewing a trans woman with Katie Couric or something. And I remember seeing that and just being so afraid, because it had connected with me so profoundly. Like I could just feel like my heart just like got pricked in that moment. And so at that time, I knew I had a pretty big problem on my hands, but I had I lived in a family and in context where I wasn't really, we were kind of this Northern European Dutch family where we didn't talk a lot about the feelings and we just went to church on Sunday. We were kind of like, we know our faith, we study our faith, and then, that's about it. There wasn't a lot of like personal warmth conversations going on. And so I just worked on it on my own. And fast forward to middle school, which is kind of where my story, I think, kind of departs and from maybe the common narrative. But I kind of hit puberty really late. So I didn't really start puberty until probably late into high school. But around 8th grade, I started getting lots of pains and I started getting sick. And for years and years and years, I was going to doctors. They thought it was, celiac, or they thought I had mono, and they thought I had, maybe colitis and all these things. And it just never was, nothing was that they would always scan me from head to toe and be like, we don't know what's going on. And in the back of my mind, I kind of thought, well, maybe it's this dysphoria. Maybe it's something is actually wrong with me. Because something that's interesting about my story is I'm also a twin. So I had this brother, that's right next to me growing up, maturing and, experiencing the world. And I'm starting to feel like I'm experiencing it very differently. And so that's something that me and him have talked about over the years as I've transitioned. Like, what was your teenage, years like when you were developing into adult and versus mine? And yeah, that was pretty interesting. And so into college, I started college, actually, I think the first time I told somebody, I was struggling with dysphoria, was a mentor of mine at my grandpa's cabin up in northern Michigan on my 18th birthday. And it was like a 6-hour standoff. Like, he knew something was wrong with me. He knew something was laying heavy on my heart, but I was just so terrified. And finally, after like 6.5 grueling hours of just like being like, you can tell me, I kind of just like wrote it on a piece of paper. Like, I feel like a girl. I want to be a girl. And I just like was so embarrassed. And so that kind of started my journey of like really wrestling with dysphoria. And from that moment on, I met with a pastor in my youth group. I met, and I was convinced that I could like beat this, you know? And so my goal was to prove this like theologically wrong. I wanted to have good, solid arguments, because even at that time, I felt like conservatives didn't have really good arguments against gender dysphoria or transitioning. And their only argument was like a kind of a reactionary towards like the LGBT agenda, like gays are bad, so therefore this is bad. And I didn't really, that wasn't satisfying for me. And I was going to a church in New York, and I sat down with my pastor and said, this is what's going on. And we had that initial confusion of like, oh, you're a gay man, and trying to like get me help. And like, you know, I met with all these like ex-gay guys in New York that were Christians. And I was just like listening to him and my pastor talk about like attractions and stuff, and like just how he started to be attracted to men. And I was like, that is not my sexual experience at all, because the way I felt like I experienced my sexuality was from a standpoint of a woman. Like all of my girlfriends and, you know, the people I grew up with, like it was very much in line with that. And so I knew I wasn't a gay man, but I didn't quite know what to do with, you know, with myself at that point. And so probably it was my junior year of college. I went to a conservative Christian college, and I'd been hospitalized a couple of times, partly probably due to just the stress and anxiety that dysphoria was having on me. And that was when I decided to seek some more answers and started asking some questions. And, you know, I think a lot of my conservative friends and pastors were all well-meaning, but this topic was just something that was so far ahead of even what they had studied. And I remember asking questions like, am I suffering unnecessarily? Like that was where I started with. Once I decided that this was something God gave me room to wrestle with, I wanted to know, am I suffering unnecessarily? If God really wants me to live as a man, then any type of sacrifice is worth it. But if I'm just living that because that's what my pastor says, or that's what people think or feel is the right way, I don't want to suffer for the rest of my life, you know, unnecessarily if God isn't calling me to that. And so that kind of started my wrestling. And I kind of grounded my search based off of like, I don't know if I'm going to transition or not, but we're kind of with this Proverbs 2's mentality, like I'm going to search after wisdom, and I'm going to, you know, yearn after it. And therefore God is going to honor that search, and he's going to guard the way of the righteous. And so that's kind of what I decided to settle in for the next few years until I transitioned.
And when did that, was it in college, later in college when you did decide to transition, or? Okay. And so while you were at a conservative
while I was in college,
Christian,
yeah.
Well, okay. So how did that go? Like, I mean, in a terminology, as you know, and my audience knows, you know, is always difficult. But, and if there's a term or whatever you would prefer that I use, please let me know. But like, I mean, you started college as a boy, as a man, you know, and
as a boy, yeah.
Junior year, senior year, now you're a girl.
Yeah.
How did that go in the college? And is it the way I described it, or do you want to describe it?
No, sure. That's fine. Yeah, totally good. Yeah, I came in it as a you know, I looked like a boy. There was nothing, you know, out of the ordinary. You know, I was a little small and stuff, but definitely wasn't, you know, average height like I am now. But it was an interesting process. You know, I kind of, the summer before I actually transitioned was the moment where you had the transgender tipping point, you had Caitlyn Jenner coming out. And I was in Korea at the time. And I remember seeing the tweet just come on of Caitlyn Jenner, and my gut just dropped, because not only was this so personal to me, because this was something I was wrestling with, but I already knew that, okay, this is going to be the stereotype in the image that everyone at my conservative college has if I decide to, transition.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're all in that that cultural context where I think things were very heightened. You think cancel culture is bad now. I mean, back then, or it's bad now, but back then it was just getting kind of started. It wasn't really that bad. And so I took a semester off and I just worked a full-time job. And that was when I was going to counseling. And I started hormone replacement therapy in the summer before I started college in the fall. Okay. And so when I started college, back at college, I probably had been on hormones for maybe 4 to 6 months. Okay. So, we're not talking a lot of change there. And I was on campus frequently there, but there was definitely, it was a small school. So there was lots of like people looking at me like, is she changing? What's going on? Yeah. So I definitely felt like the microscope. But to my college's credit, they wanted me to come back. The process of reintegrating in the community was difficult, but it definitely was a learning experience on both ends because, we had a college that wants to, maintain a historic Christian, position, which, I think we could talk about this later. I don't think there has been a historic Christian position on gender dysphoria. I think in terms of sexuality, there is, but they wanted to do that, but they also wanted me to feel involved. And so that little balancing act was definitely hard at times, but I was really grateful that I got to, come back and finish my degree at the college that I started at.
Okay. What was your social environment like? I mean, my assumption would be that was super stressful. I would imagine that probably added to the anxiety, but how did, I guess, your student peers receive you, and how about faculty? Like, were there tensions there, or was it a good experience, or a blend of both? Or
yeah, well, I think too. It was basically like having 2 freshman years for me. So I did 2 years, and King's is it's divided into these like house systems. My school was. And so there was like male house and female house. So that became difficult because all of the social environment was surrounded. And a lot of, I think, my friends from the first 2.5 years, it was a hard adjustment. And so some of them I didn't really talk to again. And it was kind of just making a lot of new friends. And then I felt also too that as a student, I was kind of, maybe being kind of hijacked, I think, a little bit by like, more liberal students that wanted to use me as kind of this agenda to kind of push forward and kind of be a thorn in the side of a conservative college. And so navigating that as a young trans, but I mean, helped me to there for me. I have one friend that I met the first day of school when I started the college, like my freshman year when I presented as male. And we are both very good friends to this day. And just to see a friend that walks with you for that long was so special. So I got to see some hurts, but also see where God really worked through the hearts of people to like keep on being that presence of Christ, even when they didn't know how to react to the situation.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's, I'm just imagining myself in your shoes going, showing up to class and, that would be frightening in many ways.
It was.
So the question everybody's going to want to know, like housing, like was that, so you, for the first few years were in male housing and then were in female housing, and then was that an issue, or is that how it went? Or?
Yeah, the school. So that, I mean, there was a lot of policies and they would have to they were kind of creating these, as they went, because they were thinking about these things. But so housing was difficult. And that was, I actually ended up living off campus. So that was the easiest way to, to do that. It also saved me lots of money. But so I lived off campus with a few girls from the college. And I actually got to, my school didn't have like dorms. So I rented a room, like an apartment in the same building that all of the apartments were in. So for me, it was almost like, it was still like, felt like living on campus, but I just had my own apartment. So,
Okay. How did you work through, you said early on you were like, no, I can beat this. I'm not going to transition to then being, reconciling your decision to transition with your faith. Was that just a lot of reading, a lot of praying, a lot of asking questions, all of the above, or?
It was, I think there is a misconception, and I think, some of your listeners might know Mark Yarhouse. He wrote Understanding Gender Dysphoria and Now Emerging Gender Identities. And one of the things that he addresses in that book is this misnomer that like, because you become trans, that your faith suffers. I mean, that can be true. And unfortunately, like you have mentioned with your studies, like 80% of LGBT people were in the church, and 50% would come back if they felt safe. And so for me, actually, my faith was rocked primarily because it was grounded on authority. I grew up in a very, I would say, legalist context where I just accepted what authority told me was right and wrong. And I think that deconstruction for me was almost more difficult than the dysphoria part. But it started out with a lot of praying and a lot of reading. I kind of started my journey with this idea that all God's truth is God's truth, that kind of famous quote from Abraham Kuyper, that there's not a square inch that Christ does not call mine. And so I felt like I could read, the opportunity to read lots of psychology, to read lots of medical journals, and to like view that through a biblical lens, but not cast it out. Because I think a lot of people, like my parents, and when I was discussing with people that were very concerned, they kind of just felt like, I don't want to look at that world. But that was very much me, like looking at like, what's the studies on this? And for me, it was a physical thing. I think a lot of the phrase you hear in secular society is like, I did this to be happy. I didn't transition to be happy. And I reiterate that to people all the time. I transitioned to be a whole and a healthy person.
Okay.
And, for me, that started with prayer, lots of prayer. It was assembling a kind of a care team around me, which was a close mentor of mine, who helped pray with me and discern, and then just taking it one step cautiously at a time. So not like really fast changes, but seeing how each change, felt. Yeah. And so that's kind of how I started out.
So how long, it was 5 years ago when you transitioned?
Yeah. In 2016.
Did it drastically reduce or even do away with your dysphoria? Do you still wrestle with gender dysphoria, would you say, or?
Yeah, I think, I think dysphoria is something that, honestly, it will never go away. Okay. It's highly mitigated. So in the same way that you think with someone with ADHD or, depression or ailment, even a more like, actual physical ailment like diabetes or, things like that, like medication and medical doesn't always solve completely the problem. It doesn't, we have a new heaven and new earth coming, which is going to solve all of that stuff. But it definitely it enormously reduces the amount of time that problem is on my head in a given day.
Okay. And I know every individual story is different, and that's part of why I'm doing this series, is just to show that like one story is one story, and for everybody it's different. If I can ask, have you ever had like any kind of regret or like, man, I'm not sure, should I have done that? Or is that just kind of part of the norm? Is that like part of the journey that everybody's on? Or because I know that's a big discussion now with, kind of seems like a growing number who maybe as a more younger teen were kind of maybe rushed into it a little too quickly, and in my opinion, and it didn't go through the vigorous process that you did. So much study and reading, and prayer, and so it seems like we're having more and more people that are kind of regretting, but again, every story isn't different.
Here's what I would say about that. I think right now, dysphoria or like transsexualism, like your previous guest talked about, it has a long history. I mean, all the way back to 1931s in Hirschfeld in Germany. And they were doing lots of studies lots of these studies were lost, unfortunately, during World War II. But transsexuality has actually been something that was documented and being studied. And right now in society, I think we have a two-layer gender thing going on. You have, I think, what's always been counted as transsexuality and kind of people that have gender nonconformity. That's kind of like, you feel like it's kind of built in from birth. And then we also have this idea of gender expression. And so I think sometimes as the church, when we're engaging these topics, like we kind of like put this like gender expression, kind of self-autonomy, like your body is something to use to like kind of like change like a skin on like a, like an Instagram filter, like to express yourself. I think that's a totally separate conversation from like transsexuality, where like gender dysphoria has meet a diagnosable threshold. It needs medical attention. And so, I think that, I view myself in the second camp, and I'm trying to remember what your initial question was.
Oh, it had to do with kind of, do you ever regret making a decision? But I like the direction you're going in though. And I'll just follow up with saying is that whatever camp that you fall into, whatever kind of, I would say experience is probably a good term for it. Whatever experience you come from really will shape the outcome. So I think that someone could have dysphoria, but maybe transitioning isn't the best option for them, because that dysphoria can come from a variety of different ways, just like depression. Depression can come from a physical ailment within the brain. It can also come from trauma. It can come from abuse. It can come from a lot of things. And you've seen that probably with your work in sexuality, is that, sexuality can come from an inborn kind of, this is something I experienced from like since I was 8, or it can also come with something because someone's addicted to porn or was abused as a kid. And so there's nuance in terms of like what you're experiencing dysphoria, but where is that dysphoria coming from? And that's why I was so cautious. And that's why I encourage like any trans person that I talk, before you start on the medical route, like let's unpack this dysphoria and see where it's coming from. Because yes, you may need a transition, but you also might need to unprocess like your ideas about gender stereotypes or your trauma that you had in your past. And I think that can result into someone transitioning and regretting versus someone transitioning and, having a well-adjusted life. But by the way, we have some internet glitches going on here. So hence the, and if we get cut off, we'll just stay put. It'll kick back on. I'm in the process. Actually, I'm so excited. Do you know Elon Musk? Elon?
Is he giving you some high-speed alien network over there?
Yeah, sort of. Well, Starlink, this whole satellite thing he started, I'm part of the beta testing group because I live in a certain area. So as we speak, I have my dish outside from Elon. I just need to hook it up and figure it out. So I'm still on my old internet speed, but my podcast my podcast following will be excited to know this will
extraterrestrial, extraterrestrial Wi-Fi there.
So this is what I mean. You defy being put in a box on so many levels. I mean, first of all, you're a very, very committed Christian. It was very much your faith that comes first in everything. And even though you decided to transition, there's gonna be some people that are like, oh, I don't know if I agree with that or whatever. But at the end of the day, you can't disagree with the fact that your faith has always been at the center of everything you've done, which seems very obvious. And also you're very much like evangelical. It's not like, oh, and now I went liberal or whatever. Like you would have, a pretty standard evangelical set of beliefs when it comes to Christianity, right? I mean, there's.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's very correct.
And not only that, but
and I argue that like the way I've thought out just how to deal and treat, I would say treat dysphoria. Like I'm still working out those ideas, but like I feel like there's a better conservative, even I think biblical based argument for in certain cases that transitioning is at least not immoral or not. So I think that I just think those arguments haven't been thought out a lot, and there's not a lot of conservatives doing those arguments because there's not a lot of conservative trans Bible loving people out there.
Now, but you kind of mentioned in passing, just to revisit it, like,
Mm-hmm.
there's different approaches to addressing dysphoria, right? You have more kind of the
Mm-hmm.
psychological first approach, like let's explore, is there
Mm-hmm.
past trauma? Is there all kinds of different things that could be going on? Let's explore those
Mm-hmm.
first. Maybe some of those experiences are connected to the dysphoria, and like the
Mm-hmm.
first thing should be let's relieve it psychologically, and maybe transitioning after we've done that
Mm-hmm.
is the best route for this person. That approach is now seen as like transphobic and conversion therapy, and it's like it's being
Mm-hmm.
kind of a lot of people pushing back against that. But it seems like you would kind of favor that if a 15-year-old says, I think I'm trans, I have dysphoria, like you wouldn't, it doesn't sound like you'd be like, all right, well, let's start transitioning. You would be a fan of exploring other options.
Yeah. I mean, I'm still a proponent of that to this day, because I always tell people that everyone focuses on the physical part of transition, and there's less focus on the spiritual aspects and the mental well-being aspects of transition. And I've always been more concerned with the latter. And I feel like that makes a more healthy transition, because you can change what your body looks like, but if you're still suffering from a lot of trauma or just misconceptions, you're still going to have a pretty rough go of it.
Right.
You still have to live with after the end of the day.
Yeah.
So
but your dysphoria, because it was early onset, like from a very, very early age, it wasn't linked to trauma, was it? Or
No. And that's that's something that a lot of people wanted to find was like, oh, were you abused as a child? What made you think this way? What made you think like you thought you were a girl? There's also this idea of like, oh, maybe you just like you've talked about like stereotypes, like maybe you're just a guy that likes to do more girly things. But for me, that never made sense, because it's like, I can go, do the most masculine thing and I can do the most girly thing. Like, it's not about me like wanting to be that stereotype. It's like really about how I feel in my body.
Right.
And also physically, like the physical symptoms that were unabated until I started hormone replacement therapy.
Oh, wow. So the physical ailments you're experiencing early in college, once you went on hormone therapy, those went away? Wow.
Yeah, they went away a lot. I mean, they didn't go away totally, but I just think that, dysphoria, like I mentioned in the blog, like what it felt like, I was trying to describe it, and you got a lot of good responses. It just kind of felt like there was this like electrical grid in my body that just didn't, like almost when you have like the lights halfway through on and off, and it's just like kind of sparking, like it just kind of felt really bad in my body all the time. I was achy, I had pains, and I kind of describe it as like if you put diesel in a regular car, like you might be able to get the engine started, but you're gonna just like rip the engine apart, and it's gonna break down on you. And that's kind of how I felt testosterone was in my body. Like I felt it when it surged in puberty, but it never felt good, and it just felt very foreign.
Wow. So let's talk about politics a little bit, because this is another area that I don't know, like I love people and stories and experiences that just there's a phrase that a journalist used, the on the edge of the inside, meaning you're in a certain maybe group or experience or whatever, but you're kind of on the like you don't fit the kind of stereotype within that. So politically, you would be very much conservative, right? I mean, are you able to talk about? And you're very much into politics. Like, that's a big part of what you do. So talk to us about.
It's been a part. Yeah, it's been a part since I was in college. I've worked on 4 campaigns across the country, and it's I'm a conservative. Right now that can mean a lot of things, as you saw. I mean, even the Republican Party right now is it's in quite disarray. So, but for me, that means limited government. It means fiscal responsibility. It means I'm really grounded in this like classical liberal idea of government that, there's rights that are inherent to human beings, and those rights are not given by government. They're protected by the government. I love kind of how I think morality, especially the Judeo-Christian worldview, has really helps enable self-government. And so those are the things that, as a person that's interested in politics, those are something that I've worked and wanted to be around for a long time. Ever since I was a first grader, I watched the State of the Union address. Now, because I'm a conservative, that means I operate in Republican spaces because largely we have a two-party system. So that also means I operate in a lot of spaces where like trans people are not very welcomed, or, there's some pretty harsh things said about me, even when I'm in the room and they don't know I'm trans. So that's just something that you learn how to navigate.
Well, how have you been received within specifically Republican spaces when they do?
So
is that are you persecuted, or
if they're libertarians, if they're more libertarian Republicans, and I am interested in libertarianism, but I've read Ayn Rand things, and like it's like can be very amoral. They kind of shun morality and just kind of like let me do you, and as long as you're not bothering anybody. But if I'm working with like your stereotypical like evangelical Republican, it never ends. It never ends well. Usually, when they find out, it kind of radically shifts their grid on how they think about me. And it also brings up this idea of like, oh, you were lying to me, which as a trans person, like, I believe you're always honest with the people that you date and that are close to you, but your people that you work with, colleagues, it's not a very, like, I think professional thing to have to announce. I mean, I'm very different because the LGBT community is very boisterous, but I think living in a modern society, we've gotten this notion that like we're owed a platform to speak all the time about ourselves and how we're oppressed and all this stuff. And I certainly had points about that and where I was like that in my younger years, but I'm learning to try to, keep my personal things away from business, from the professional world.
Yeah, that is. I mean, it's like, yes, it's obviously a huge part of your story, your life, but it also like, I can imagine many conversations, even relationships that it's like, it's not like you need to, hi, my name's Addie, and by the way, here's my whole story. And, it just would be kind of almost awkward in some contexts. We talked about this offline just briefly, but can you explain the difference between transsexual and transgender, and what are your thoughts on that? And your perspective? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I feel transgender, as a lot of definitions, if I can be political on the left, they have widely expanded. So the way I kind of start with this to make it, kind of understandable to people that are not into this word kind of conversation is like, when you used to call someone a gentleman, in Renaissance or in Europe, it used to actually connote an information. It used to mean that you're landed, you owned property, you might have been knighted. It associated like a title with responsibilities and whatever. Now we call gentlemen like, oh, you're such a gentleman because you opened the door for me. Like that doesn't tell me anything about who you are except a subjective kind of, oh, you're nice. So the definition is subjective. So it means nothing. I feel like transgender has suffered from that same phenomenon. Is transgender used to kind of mean roughly be synonymous with transsexual. The only difference is that transsexuals were medically transitioned and transgender people weren't. That's how it kind of was defined when I was first researching it back in like high school. But now transgender, as per definition, is an umbrella term that encompasses A, B, C, D, E, F, G, so you really don't know when you say I'm transgender, like what that person's saying. And so because of that, I've kind of shifted to transsexual. And when I'm in an environment where I'm talking about this, because then you go, okay, I know that you're a person that medically transitioned.
Okay. Yeah. I noticed too, it seems like, and for various reasons, maybe there are some older trans people who would prefer transsexual, whereas transgender, kind of like gay, lesbian, and queer. The younger generation is latching on to queer more than an older generation. But there's also some people like Miranda Yardley who I had on who is it's more of a I think she would see like transgender as more of a an activism, science denial,
Yeah.
biology denial, whereas she's like, no, I mean, I transition is the best way to kind of
Yeah.
relieve
I mean,
my dysphoria,
I can,
but I'm not going to deny the fact
yeah.
of my biological reality. Or is there some of that maybe in your?
Yeah, I mean, and I differ than Yardley too a little bit because, we talk about biological sex, and this was a big discussion when I first decided to transition. It's like, well, God's intent was you to be a male. And, I listened to one of your very old podcasts with Leanne, and
Oh yeah,
she was an intersex Christian,
right,
and
yeah.
she by far was one of the stories that you covered that like I identified with the most.
Okay.
Just kind of, on average, I was a very small boy growing up, and I never really met average weight and height statistics, but with the physical component of me, I started thinking when I was researching, like, I know there's intersex cases, and I never try to I don't want to push those two categories together because that can be unhelpful and things like that. But to me, I operate out of this idea that we live in a fallen world. And so therefore a number of things can go wrong with our development. And this kind of touches on brain sex theory a little bit, even though that's something that has been far from fully proved. Right. But to me, my issues were so physical and so body related that it felt to me like, okay, well, if you have all these different type of intersex cases, ranging from very obvious to, just your chromosomes being mixed, but no one really knows you're intersex. It seems to me plausible that something physically could be going on with me where, my body is just not
right.
Fully physically male formed, whether that's just internally or,
That's interesting. Do you know, I mean, if I can ask, do you know if you have an intersex?
I don't, I don't know. I don't, I don't, I doubt I do, but that was something just because when I was growing up and it was such a physical thing, I remember thinking over and over again, maybe I am intersex, or maybe there's something our parents don't know, just because I was like, why do I feel so horrible all the time?
Yeah.
So
another unique thing, and I how do I say, you talk so freely and openly and comfortably. I mean, this is a personal topic for you, obviously, and it's you don't even mind if I ask kind of personal questions like that, or even you seem to operate extremely well with different perspectives, agree to disagree. You're a big advocate of free speech, and you're not, I've never sensed at all you kind of demanding somebody agrees with you at all. How is that? I mean, how do you do that? Because that does seem to be abnormal in this conversation. It's so volatile, and people are so they can't even be in a room with somebody that disagrees slightly with them. But you're very different.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think a lot of it, I will start, is the grace of God. Therefore the grace of God, there go I. My journey has been so lockstep with Christ that I feel like I have been given an extra sense of calmness and just peace when I've dealt with people that will literally come up to me in a church context. I'm in a group of people and they will, and it's very disrespectful because they didn't need to jump into that conversation.
Yeah.
Real quick, and they just kind of do
Addie,
that.
You cut out. Can you go back just 10 seconds?
Oh,
it's really important. Yeah. In a church context.
Yeah. No, I'm glad. Yeah. In the church context, because, God has given me a lot of grace, because I've had people that have come up to me and just purposely used he, him pronouns when I'm in a group that doesn't know I'm trans.
Oh, wow.
because they knew I'm trans. I was a small group I was in New York, and they found out I was trans. And so I literally sat down with them. I let them give me their spiel for 2 hours about how I'm wrong and how I'm deceived and all this stuff. And I am polite, and I give back my research and the things that I'm thinking about. And oftentimes it's met with well, no, I can't consider that. But every time I've ended those conversations, it's always ended with, wow, you do really care about scripture. And I think this is important that you bring it up, because in secular society, it's all about me and getting my voice heard. And I think a lot of this shouting and canceling is I need to feel safe in you. And what does Christ teach us? He teaches us to be the opposite. Make yourself uncomfortable to be around those that are at the margins of society. And that is a gospel thing through and through. And I think it's something that the church really does need to work on, because so many times fundamental evangelical conservatives, however you want to categorize it, they don't operate with that. They operate with this mindset that you need to know that I think you're wrong so that I can talk to you. And that's not of Christ. I'm
just kind of stunned right now, honestly. Like, you have so much to teach us. And I'm just so thankful you exist, and your voice, but more than that, just your humility. Like that, what you just said, I mean, given your experience with dysphoria and the anxiety and wrestling with that and your faith and whether to transition, I mean, all these things, to then have you be in a position where you are still extending grace to somebody that really has no clue. That's very unique, as you know. So thank you for your posture and modeling that. That's incredible.
It's hard.
Oh, I bet it is.
It's not been easy, but
yeah. God, can you give us a good experience you've had with somebody maybe that is maybe still might not agree with you on everything in this conversation, but is showing you the same kind of love and grace that you've had to extend to so many people?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Like, it's what's cool about being, one cool thing about being trans. There's not a lot of cool things about being trans, but you get to, because sometimes you're on the margins, you get to experience a side of Christ and see how he works to fill your needs as a person that kind of lives, like you said, on the edges. And I've encountered a few people in my life that I would just say like have that Christ likeness, where they disagree with me, but they have constantly, been there. One of my friends, the one that I told you about, I met the first day of school for my freshman year. I know we've disagreed on a lot, and she probably didn't like really agree with like maybe my steps to transition, but was always there to talk it out, have a lot of these type of conversations that we're having now. There was another, a guy in my house when I was in college, and, he was definitely very like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to deal with this. But from the moment I came back to school, he decided that, God's calling me to be a friend to her. We would go out to lunch once a month. He helped me move when I moved apartments in New York, like he helped me carry stuff up my like 5-story walk up. And just seeing that was like, wow, like you disagree with me, but you want to understand and you want to get to know why I made the decisions I did. And so that's something that's been very special. And then just people that still open your homes, allow me to watch their kids, do all these things that's part of, I think, like Christian life, and they don't feel scandalized that you're in life with them. Just like Jesus didn't feel scandalized by the people he chose to break bread with. And I think that's been some ways I've really seen some really good moments in church.
Wow, that's such a good word. Are you like currently, because I mean, I would imagine you would find your home and identity in a more conservative church. And yet, obviously, your story, could bring challenges to some people there, and even church policies and stuff. How do you navigate that? Has that been difficult, or have you found a good home? Or?
Yeah, it's been difficult. I've been in. I just don't want to go to more liberal churches because I just don't agree with the theology. But so often I've been in like not even mainline. I've been in like conservative churches, like the PCA and the RCA and the, right now I'm in Dutch West Michigan, so it's all CRC, but I have yet to open up at one of those conservative churches. I mean, early in my transition, it was kind of like obvious, like here's this person that's transitioning. Now it's kind of dependent on me disclosing that information. And that's just something I've decided not to do because I don't want to rush into it. And, I want to, I think, experience Christian fellowship. And I think that doesn't always require to be the most vulnerable
Yeah.
all the time. It's
Right.
it's picking your, I heard this phrase, like Jesus had his one, he had his three, he had his 12, and he had his 5,000. And it's like, who are your
Huh.
who's the disciple that's most loved, who you're going to share everything with, and who is like what information needs to be shared where is kind of like what you have to learn how to do.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, you can, yeah, I can imagine you can
Yeah.
be in a church and no one's gonna think anything unless you kind of bring it up. So
Yeah.
well, which can be great. I can imagine the stress though of when that conversation comes up, or if they're like, "Hey, would you lead this, or do you want to be a deacon or elder?" And you're like, "Well, maybe I need to share my,"
Yeah. And I've gotten into things where, like one church, you had to get like a background check because they required everyone to like be in the nursery once a quarter or something. And so I just was kind of like, oh, I just not going to become a member like right now, like, because I didn't know what to do.
yeah,
That was the first time that I, had experienced that. And so I just kind of serve from the margins. Like you can always serve. And my goal, when I transitioned was, how do I do this in a holy manner? Like, how do you do it in a manner that's set apart from the world? And so I want to be the best light I can for Christ, even if people are not going to treat me with the same type of compassion. And so it's really hard, if people do find out and you're the one that's like serving others and doing the work of Christ, and then they're going to kick you out of the church because, you made a decision. So, and then like, it's always about that disposition of respecting authority, but being willing to talk about it like we are right now.
yeah,
Good. So yeah, that's what I try to do.
Yeah,
Not always perfectly, but
yeah. Well, man, we're coming up here close to an hour. Do you have any last words or things you'd like to say to the audience? I mean, I'm sure people are really, enjoying this conversation, I hope. Any last words, anything that you'd like people to know about maybe the conversation as a whole, your story, or how we move forward? And
I would say that this is definitely, I think, it's a hot topic in society and obviously by extension in the church, but I think that the way the church engages, and this is why I've appreciated your work, is so important, to not be reactive against like what's happening in culture, because ultimately, like, in the kingdom of man, like culture is gonna be left to its devices in some regards. And as Christians, it's our responsibility to be out in society and being the salt and light. But that's going to mean having a very relational, aspect with the people that you disagree with. Realizing that like God doesn't work on the same timeline we do. And so because someone is starting to transition, or because someone has already transitioned, or because someone's wrestling, doesn't mean they're always going to be wrestling. And it's not like you should meet someone that is trans and then convince them that they're wrong. And that like every trans person isn't, a lot of trans people that you never get to talk to, you've probably met because they transition, they get on with their lives and they go back into, society. And so that's something to remember. And then also just, I think when we think about using scripture as a battering ram, there's some things that I've heard, like the constant one is like, take up your cross. That's been told me millions and millions of times. It's kind of out of context when, Christ is asking us to deny ourselves and give up our life. But and that's in relation to him picking up the cross and doing what God was calling him to. But it's not this idea of like, oh, because I have physical ailments, I should just live with those physical ailments. Right. I mean, and that's kind of how it's been brought in my context. Like, oh God, this is your thorn. Like wrestle with the dysphoria. It's kind of wrong for you to want it to be mitigated. And I think I've always said there's a proper context. Like I'm not looking for the magic pill. And when I get to heaven, I know all things will be made new. I know that my body, my mind will be right. I don't know if I'll be male or female in heaven, but I'll be happy because it's the Lord's will be done. But just using that verse is like, you should never want to escape physical suffering. I think that's so wrongheaded, because when I read the gospel, and I learned this kind of as I was just chronically suffering with sickness and pain, is that Jesus starts his ministry with healing physical ailments. I mean, I was counting before I got on the show. In Matthew, there's 16 stories of healing out of 28 chapters. In Mark, there's like 16 stories, instances of God healing. And these are just things that they say we only recorded. And there's so much more that was done that couldn't even fit the books. And so I kind of encourage Christians to think of James, in this instance of like, if you just say, go to a brother that's like poorly clothed and sick, if you just say, go peace, be well and be filled, like you're not really keeping your obligation as a Christian. You might be, but if you just say, well, you just have to suffer this, and you're not going to provide any route forward for that believer to experience some type of relief, like I think that's kind of wrongheaded. Well, and so I encourage people.
No, I so appreciate that. And I've often said, if you are calling somebody else to a really difficult, challenging path that you see as the best path of discipleship, man, you better be committed to that person relationally.
You better be,
create a community where they can flourish to the best of their possibility. And even picking up your cross, denying yourself, that really is the main point. Seems to be sacrificing yourself for the good of others, like Jesus giving, taking on this hard road so that he can sacrifice. So it's not really talking. Maybe the thorn in the flesh passage might be a little more.
Yeah, it might be. Yeah.
Yeah. You might have to endure some ailment, whatever. But the picking up your cross is more about serving others through sacrifice.
And so that's my biggest.
I was going to ask you, but you said it. You're not sure if you'll be male or female in heaven. I didn't want to ask that, because I almost felt like that was almost too personal. I don't know, but that's interesting. You're like, I don't know how this is going to work. It's going to be worked out. I don't know
I don't know, but it's going to be okay. And that's how I've always been. Because, people say, well, God's intention. And when they keep on saying God's intention, I give them the words of Job. Like, do you speak for God? Are you communicating with him like ear to ear? Because, Job's friends get chastised at the end. And that's what I think a lot of people forget about. They hear Job repenting, and they forget that the friends were not in the right boat in that situation. And so if you're just coming along a trans person, not knowing their story, not knowing anything, and just saying like, you need to repent because this is God's punishment on you. I don't think that's how Jesus would have approached a trans person. I don't think so. And so, I don't know if I'm going to be male or female, but it's going to be okay, because it's going to be, perfect. So,
which is where the hope of that's where all of our hope should be. Kind of like, is he going to judge this person in or out or whatever? It's like, at the end of the day, it's Genesis 18. The judge of the world will do what is right. God will put together his creation the way he sees best. The specifics of how we want that to come about are secondary, a distant secondary. Our rock solid hope is in the fact that he will put it together.
Amen. No, I love that. And that's what gives me the most hope every day. Because like you said, or like I said earlier, dysphoria won't always go away. It's sadly, my sister is autistic. It's something she's going to have to live with forever through this life. And dysphoria is kind of the thing that I have to work through in this life. And the thing that gives me hope always is looking towards, what's in store for the future. So
that's a great word to end on. Addie, thank you so much for being on the show. And wish you the best in your political adventures. That's a whole nother podcast that I would love to.
I know.
Thanks so much for being on Theology Now. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Preston.